Hello everybody and welcome to episode 8 of the Dead Pixel podcast. This week we'll be talking about the power of protest. I'm one of your hosts, Mr. Brown, and as ever I'm joined by a multitude of co-hosts. This week joining me is Mr. Orange. Hello Mr. Orange.
Hiya, how are you tonight?
I'm very well, thank you. Mr. Pink, how you doing, pal?
Hello there, yes, back again.
And as ever, the legend, Mr. White, how are you, pal?
Good morning, good evening, whatever your time. Good to see you guys. Nice to be with you.
Okay, so we appreciate, guys, we just invaded Iraq for the third time in my lifetime. But I believe we've covered this in previous episodes. So if anybody's interested in what the Dead Pixels have to say about Iraq, please see previous podcast. So this week, hopefully in honour of any protests that may occur, now that we're back on the war setting, it is the power of protests. And quite an interesting one, really. It seems quite bland on the surface, but the more you look into protests, whenever there's something going on, whenever people are disgruntled en masse or we're invading other countries, protests do occur. They can be quite powerful. A mixed bag, really. It doesn't seem to be about how many numbers there are, what the particular topic is. It just seems to be almost like it has to be perfect timing to go with a kind of a movement and whatnot. Historical ones in the past, we've got the Boston Tea Party, East Berlin protests, Soweto uprisings, and most recently I would say one of the most successful ones was Egypt. Over 1 million people overthrew Mubarak, who had been in a 30-year reign. So guys, power of protests. Anybody got any thoughts, any initial feelings about protests? Mr. Orange, I know you've been on a few in the past. What's your thoughts on protests, mate?
Yeah, I think protest is an important part of any society. I think it's an important part of democracy to have opposing views being able to be expressed, and if they're not able to be expressed in Parliament or by voices with power, then I think you need to have some form of getting a message out there, getting yourself heard, and getting yourself heard as a group, as opposed to just individual ideas flinging around. Because obviously, if it's a group, then it's a common shared idea, and I think protest is one of the few ways that can be brought about in a democratic and especially an undemocratic society, of which there are many around the world.
Yeah, that's a good point, yeah. Just to put into perspective a number of famous protests, there is one of the most famous ones, the East Berlin protest in 1989. Now that one had up to 1 million, my research tells me, regarding what's considered the end of communism within Eastern Germany. Now, just as a sort of a parallel to that, the Iraq war that we've all lived through in the UK and whatnot, there was up to 2 million people protesting with that one, and yet, we still went to war with that one. So it doesn't seem to be a numbers issue here. Mr. Pink, have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, East Berlin came up as one of the most successful ones, if one of the only ones where change was affected directly by that protest itself. So it's quite an interesting one to start off with. I mean, there have been other successful protests, but this one affected change then and there as a result of the protest. It is interesting. It's sad to see that 2 million people couldn't change the minds of a government hell-bent on making profit by invading another sovereign state, but these are the times we live in, and I think that may well be its own topic, that war crimes in the UK.
And what's remarkable about that one, in hindsight, it looks like those 2 million people that bothered to come out on that day were actually right, weren't they?
Yeah. Well, we never did find these weapons of mass destruction.
No. Mr. White, have you got any thoughts on protests? Have you got any experience? Or I know you're not necessarily from the UK. Is anything you've ever been a part of or ever seen that's been, that's quite interesting to you?
Yeah, I was a part of one movement, but I never actually went to the protest. It was a reform in my country that students wasn't happy about, and it's a small country, and it was around 50,000 younglings
Okay,
marching
decent.
to the capital. Yeah, I wasn't a part of it because I was still studying in school, and I was told if I'm gonna, take part of it, they're gonna note my name and everything, basically, try to scaremonger me.
Okay.
So yeah, but the thing is, the effect of that protest didn't get anywhere. Literally, politicians say it's just, it's just a show. It's nothing to do with real life and that kind of crap. Basically, didn't come out anywhere. So as I said, as bigger the protest gets, the less effect you're gonna get, unless it's been organized properly, through,
See, that's quite interesting to say that, because generally speaking, people would think that the more people involved in a protest, the more chance of that solidarity kicking in. So what's making you think that the smaller the protest, the bigger the gain? Then that's quite
interesting. I'm not talking about the aggressive protest here. I'm not talking about the protest that actually led to overthrow the country, because that's already overthrown a revolution. But I'm talking about the protest, peaceful, with the flags, with the banners and everything. Usually those protests, as big as it gets, that means basically the subject already been a pain in some higher society as. So what I'm trying to say, the agenda already been written off. So usually small protests, for example, the local shop sells something and you go in there, it's more likely for that shop to listen to the local residents rather than you join a mass protest, for example, an environment, or stop killing poaching tigers, or stop invading Iraq, and it's already pre-written. Nobody gonna be able to change it without actually getting radical on it.
Okay, Mr. Orange, you got something to say about that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think when you talk about having an effect in making change, as I've said before, with protests, I think obviously you don't always see the results straight away, or the results from that specific protest.
Are you thinking that more it's a statement of intent rather than something that people believe will change something specific? It's more of a statement of unrest. They want history to mark that statement. Mr. Pete, you had your hand up before, didn't you? Was there something relevant to what?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I had something relevant to what Mr. White was saying. Just the smaller protests. Yeah, fair enough. They can be more localized, and therefore more effective for localized issues. Hunger strike. You can't get much smaller of a protest than that. Remember the people in H Division over in Northern Ireland?
Mm-hmm.
Hunger strike. Oh yeah, they won't eat. So the government just changes the rules, and once they lose consciousness, they can force feed them. Thus, no loss of life, and they didn't win their point. And they were on hunger strike for years, and they used to IV treat them. Now, I mean, the effectiveness of protest, I think, can be shown. I mean, we certainly have seen lots of protests. Whether those lead to change straight away, not too sure. But we have to remember that America started off as a protest against tax, and against no taxation without representation. The former USSR, again, protest against war, which they didn't want to be in, and already existing problems with the Tsarist monarchy-ruled empire. We've got even good old Hitler. What we're on with, around 13 minutes, and we've already got him in. Started off as a protest vote against communism and the communist brigades that were in Berlin, and the rich financiers put their hands in their pockets and want the Nazi Party to step in and sort the situation out. So I think protests do start and do get into the public domain points, and I think it's the public wants to get interested in these things, then affect change. But you can also see why governments are scared to death of protest, because they can lead to overthrowing of the governments and massive change en masse. Mr. Orange, I can see you waving.
Yeah, I think the point you're making is it's a cumulative effect, and it's along with other changes in society or other actions in society which, protests maybe have their biggest power is not just saying like there on that day, but the fact that, you know, there's maybe a few protests to start with, you know, a bit of a movement one way or the other politically, and it's kind of, it helps sort of if it happens a lot and it's going to lead to a tide in a certain direction, maybe more in the past than today because of the way protests are kind of shut down a little bit, and maybe that's one of the reasons they are shut down a little bit. Or maybe not.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. Yeah. I think something about protests as well what I find interesting. In rich countries in the West, I think there's also a cost issue with protests, depending on how big it is, depending on who stops working and everything like that. Now, I think years ago, I'm talking maybe, you know, a century ago, mass protests in the UK and whatnot, they would shut down the country and things could actually get changed. But I do think like now the blueprint's sort of been done now, and I think governments, they're very wise to what was once shocking, and there's just this feeling now, especially in the West, that they've got it all boxed off. So what they say is, right, okay, now you've got to actually apply for your protests, yeah?
Yeah.
Because if you don't apply for it, then they can be a bit more heavy-handed. Things like that. I mean, you know, shut down industry, but in rich countries, they'll factor that in as well, you know. So, for example, if they say, right, we're going to go to war, well, yes, there's going to be these protests, right? Well, I'll tell you what, there'll be a bit of a budget for those protests, which will cover anything like that. So, Mr. Pink.
I think you've quite succinctly hit the nail on the head there. I mean, the first rule of Fight Club, as it were, that as soon as your protest has achieved power, you've successfully orchestrated the revolution, you're now in power, the first thing to do is shut those loopholes that allowed you to get into power because you don't want to be usurped. Now, you've seen that in the West through America there, and you've seen it also in the East and in Europe. As soon as these things happen, they then start closing those loopholes. And I think in today's day and age, the governments are very media savvy, more so than they let on, NSA. And they do want to shut these things down. I mean, you've seen how protests in the UK in particular, you see these trucks coming up with CCTV on there, and policemen whose only job is not to police the protest, is to video and hopefully put a name to people within the protest. I think that is scary, and that turns a lot of people off.
Tag your friend on police video.
Like Mr. White with the younglings, they didn't want to have the rest of their life tarred with this particular protest. So I guess a lot of people did not actually go.
Yeah, and plus as well, I mean, I've actually been on protests where the filming have taken place. Most notably was the G8 one. I went up to Edinburgh. They were doing coaches for my university, and it was a massive protest. I don't know if you guys remember it. But I could not believe that in a protest that was simply trying to influence the richest nations into giving aid to third world countries, we were being filmed by policemen, exactly as Mr. Pink said. No other reason than they were there filming us. Now what that's going to do is, that's going to take away the radical element, because it's be those guys that they're after, so they'll be wise to that, so they won't go. Yeah, and also put people off, as Mr. Pink has just rightly said there, people going. So you're going to get this sort of diluted group anyway, simply by the fact that of this one act of filming him, gets rid of the radicals and also stops sort of people thinking, well, I don't want to be filmed. You're going to get this diluted section of society protesting, and really, is that really who you want protesting? Mr. Orange?
Yeah, I was just going to mention also, what you're having that is the people who don't want to be noticed, who'll turn up, black hoodies, all in black, masked up, and then obviously that's an effective way of hiding your identity, but at the same time makes you look like the bad guys if you go out to a protest looking like that. Yeah. It doesn't look, you know, to some family people sitting at home watching TV, seeing that, they're just going to think, oh, they're just a bunch of hoodlums, or, you know, whatever term they're going to use.
Yeah, no, good point, yeah, brilliant point, yeah.
Same problem as a burqa then. I mean, in the effort to maintain their anonymity and therefore be anonymous, they get labelled anonymous, who is starting to be in the media pigeonholed as this group of hoodies and things like that, which I don't think's very true. I don't think that's true. But all they want is their anonymity. And
Okay, basically, my point is that in this society, being anonymous is held up as something, I think, something bad or something to be scared of. And I think it's always seen as, it's the same question. If you don't want to disclose something, people say, well, why have you got something to hide then? You must have something to hide if you don't want to disclose something. And I think it's the same with image. If you're saying, I want to wear a burqa or I don't want my face seen, then they immediately think, oh, there must be some sinister reason behind it. And I think it's been propagated by the media, and I think part of that is so that, you know, people have a little bit of power when they're anonymous, because they have a freedom that they don't have when they're not, as we know on this show. And I think that's another reason why that's kind of pushed forward, and also in protests.
Yep. Mr. Pink?
Just a thought that occurred. I think what we're certainly seeing at the moment is different ways of protesting. I saw a brilliant piece today. It actually happened to be on RT. I happened to be on my lunch. It was just in the background. A satirist. I think he was Romanian. And yes, I think. Yeah, you were with me as well. Yeah,
He was. Yeah.
It was absolutely perfect. I just wish that when he'd filmed this, he got the name of the young Conservative that was attending the Conservatives meeting there in Birmingham, and he set him up. Hopefully, I'll be able to get a link and put it in there, and you'll be able to watch it yourselves.
They can't let the Islamic State carry on doing what it's doing.
Because they're too barbaric. What we're doing with the Saudis are even more barbaric. They beheaded more people than ISIS.
Well, at least they have a so-called rule of law there.
In Saudi.
In Saudi Arabia.
That's something.
I'm not defending what they do in Saudi Arabia, but what can I say? Apparently it's an ally.
Yeah.
I thought, well, that's your career done, son. But it was just that's it. It's already been captured, and that's streaming everywhere. You're not going to be able to get rid of that. And I think that is a new way of protesting, using media and mass media against them. I mean, I'm sure it was shut down. I'm sure that the NSA and things like that will be able to grip hold of the internet and squeeze it out of there in time. But for now, en masse protest doesn't seem to be being taken seriously. And I think maybe because the people, as Mr. Brown said, the people actually taking part aren't always voters or voters that count for the particular government in power. Mr. Brown?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, for me, there seems to be the two sides to a protest. There's the numbers game, which people assume, you know, get as many people. I mean, I've been involved in protests in the past, and there's been people like, if you know people, get them down and blah, blah. It's not really even about sometimes educating people on the specifics of what that protest is. Yeah. It's as though the people believe the more people involved, you know, the bigger the statement. Now, just going back to the figures before, so just to recap there, in East Germany, there was up to 1 million people effectively brought down communism in East Germany, whereas up to 2 million people couldn't stop, you know, Labour waging war in Iraq. So the numbers issue is suspect in itself. So then it becomes something else. Maybe it's a movement issue. So a protest is sort of like an arm of a movement. Now, sometimes, I mean, I know Mr. Pink was saying before about how East Germany was, from what he's read, you know, something instant, spontaneous that actually had an effect on the day. I kind of not agree with that, in the sense that it was an anti-communist protest, and obviously there'd been an anti-communist fever and undercurrent throughout many, many countries. That was more of a catalyst of that undercurrent. But there is one protest actually that actually I absolutely love, that I think was one that was spontaneous and did actually have the action, and that was in Venezuela, when the late Hugo Chavez was actually kidnapped. He was the elected president of Venezuela, and he was actually he was a military coup, and he was kidnapped and forced to resign. He refused to resign, and he actually, in his memoirs, he said he was in a helicopter, he was taken to a beach, and he was actually going to be executed. Now what happened was, they called it the Million Man March, Whether it's a million or not, I don't know. But 1 million people literally went down into Caracas, surrounded the presidential palace, spontaneously, and demanded their president back. Now, according to myth or legend or whatever, the soldier that was going to execute Hugo Chavez actually started to cry and said, "I can't do it. You're the elected leader," and blah blah blah. That might be, romanticised, whatever. But he wasn't executed. 1 million people protest. He was actually flown back to the presidential palace, and as you say, the rest is history. So I think that one is one where there's an absolute immediate effect where people need to come out of their houses if they want change that evening. And I think sometimes, pretty much like the East Germany one, also like the Russian Revolution, or any big revolution really, it is a catalyst, but it's also an immediacy of a movement. It becomes a time. It's like the Russian Revolution. There was a few attempts before the actual, before the October Revolution. And that just shows you, even in that sort of fervour and that heated mass of people, the timing is everything, and it has to be attached to a fairly, not intellectual, but fairly organised movement that has a direction, a very clear purpose. Mr. Pink.
Just realised why the 2 million people weren't able to effect change and stop the invasion of Iraq. I've just gone back to my reading, and there's one key point which I failed to realise that links the East Berlin anti-communist movement there and the 2 million people that weren't listened to in the UK. The people in the UK did not have the Hof. Now, this is very important. You must have the Hof to effect change. No, but also celebrities. Love them or loathe them, they can add a certain weight. We have seen a little bit at the moment. There was a green movement about 2 weeks ago, trying to...
Leonardo.
all over the world.
Leonardo
DiCaprio, and I think it was Emma Thompson in the UK, and yes, I mean, it's alright for you guys. You can pay the extra for your energy, but for the masses who are actually being priced out of the market with frozen wages, no pensions to speak of, and ever-increasing cost of living, maybe now's not the bloody time. So yes, timing is everything, and I think, your East Berlin conclusion, absolutely apt. Very well timed. The Russian Revolution, well timed. Sorry, Mr. White, I believe you have something to say?
Yeah, just a quick word in regards to the communism time. It's accumulated towards the time, firstly, that there was no longer such repression as sending people to Siberia as much as it was in the 40s. Economy went shredded down, so you can imagine the shelves of every single shop was empty. The people, literally, some people were starving, some people didn't have enough, products produced, but everything went basically to the defense. And people, that hatred is accumulated in, and it was like a volcano that exploded in one go. So not only that there was anti-communist, there was just people also not happy with the situation in the country, because communism itself isn't a bad structure. It's not perfect, but it's not bad if it's been used properly. But if people are not unhappy because excuse me, they don't have enough, the day-to-day need stuff, then obviously there won't be, the unhappiness will just gonna raise, and you're just gonna walk out the street, support whatever movement is going, and it happened to be the United German movement.
Well, thanks for the valiant defence of Soviet communism there, but back to protests.
Communism there brought to heel by rampant capitalism and Levi jeans.
And the Hof.
On the Hof.
Mr. Orange, please.
It's probably on earlier points that we've raised, but I think part of the thing we were kind of touching on is like the development of protesting now. The fact that you can protest, obviously, with individual people. I don't know if you noticed at the recent Scottish election votes, the Labour Party went up and marched in Glasgow to try and get support for the no vote. and they were followed around by two guys on bikes playing the Star Wars theme. And I mean, that's two guys protesting who basically made the whole party there look completely stupid, completely undermined what that party was doing.
Right,
and as I say, it's in innovative ways.
Yeah, Mr. Orange, you understand there. So some protests have a novelty factor, don't they? And sometimes they're a lot more powerful than sort of mass movements, from what you sort of saying there. And I do remember one that struck me. I think it was Ukraine, but don't quote me on that one. And it was all these old women going up to soldiers with mirrors, and they were literally holding these mirrors in front of the soldiers as if to say, "Do you see what you look like?" And it's that old one as well where people put flowers in guns and stuff like that. I mean, for me, I know that one's kind of an old one now, but can you imagine the first time you ever saw that? That would have been one of the most powerful, subtle sort of powerful images of any protest that you would have seen up until that point. Mr. Pink?
Absolutely agreeing with you. I mean, so powerful that it's satire in itself. You see it in certain, like The Watchmen there. You saw the flower going and then you heard the crack of the gun to put it in a different reality. Again, very powerful moment. Mr. Orange?
And obviously, I was going to bring it on to, you've got the more subtle forms of protest in art and in satire and comedy and all of these things. It's
the Daily Show. It's a political show. I mean, he does cover the facts. He's quite sinister about most of the stuff governments come out with, and you laugh about. But the thing is, does it have an effect of that protest? Does anything change over this? And the problem I see that it's not, even though he laughs about how the politicians invaded the Iraq, which showing the nonsense proof, and that's on the national TV, people laughing about it, but it is kind of a protest as well, is it?
It's maybe an acceptable form of protest.
Yeah.
You're allowed to laugh at.
Yeah,
laugh at them.
Right, but there's no effect of it. That's the problem.
But that's why it's allowed.
Mr. Pink?
I mean, yeah, give it its due. It's a state-allowed protest, and it's tee-hee-hee, but at least it could be a gateway drug to other, bring it into the minds of the people. Oh, actually, yeah, we could protest about this. Maybe it's that, and that is about the only saving grace of it. I mean, it is comedy, and the man's making a hell of a lot of money out of it.
Yeah.
So
it's
not altruistic, is it? Come on.
If you're going to be part of a movement, maybe you're supposed to cover the full spectrum. I mean, if you can get yourself your point or opinion or your movement on something like the Daily Show, or you go on a chat show, or, Jonathan Ross or something like that. I mean, that in itself is sort of showing you where you're at within the mainstream of society. And there's a time for action, isn't there? There's a time for radical action. But should you not be cleverer these days? And let's face it, if the mainstream, as much as we hate them, and I particularly hate them, if they're not on your side, can you really expect change, Mr. Orange?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it seems like there's an unwritten rule about, talking about anything, that if it's funny, you get away with it. So it needs to be used by people who are trying to change the world, or at least have an impact or get their point across. Well, it's just another avenue. It's never going to be the main one, but it's another thing. It's like I said, like art, like graffiti, like subvertising, like when you go out and you see, an art billboard or something and you graffiti it with a political message, all of these things. I mean, they're little, but, they have some effect and they are some form of protest.
Yeah.
They make making people think, don't they? And I agree, I strongly believe that even if you walk out on a march for some idea and everything, you're still drawing the attention of people. And people might start digging a bit deeper and just at least start to, to at least ask the question and get a bit of a wider knowledge of it. It's not always helping, but Mr. Brown.
Yeah, I was just going to go into the subject of what about oversaturation? I mean, in the past, you used to have protests that were always to do with working conditions, you know, things that really affected people's lives because lives were literally on the breadline. So if people weren't motivated and they didn't act, you know, real lives, real children and whatnot would suffer. But, you know, you can reel them off these days. You know, you've got animal rights, environment rights, you've got Fathers for Justice, you've got celebrity this, celebrity that. I mean, you know, is the age of protest a little bit of a satire of itself? I mean, you know, anybody now seems to sort of attach themselves to a protest, and isn't this idea of an oversaturation in society of protests? Have they not lost their appeal in some way? Is it just another protest? Whereas in the past, I mean, protests were shocking in the past. If people rose up en masse, okay, they might not have got what they wanted, but people in society were actually shocked. You know, is that shock value? Is it of any worth? Does it even exist anymore, Mr. Pink?
I think the only way to lend any more value to your cause now is to shock, to go further. Rightly so. I mean, you've seen that normal protests, i.e. people marching down. I mean, the days of the Jarrow March where, oh my God, they're not conforming. Oh, why are they not conforming? And it brings the public interest in the newspapers to this cause. Now, not so much. They reran the Jarrow March for the NHS, and it just didn't get anywhere near the media support or any of the comments or anything. It didn't get picked up really. Not very satisfactorily at all. But yeah, this is where you get radicalisation, and they feel that they're not being listened to, and they feel that the only way to actually be listened to is to shock them and actually get some attention, whether that be good attention or bad attention. Please, Mr. Brown.
Yeah, I think you got a good point there. I'm just going to bring up actually, like, I don't know if people know the history of the terms of civil disobedience and civil resistance and whatnot. But civil disobedience, it comes from sort of 19th century American essayist called Henry Thoreau. He was the first person that deemed, you know, they actually created the line civil disobedience. Now this is a time, and it seems a little bit of a chaotic time to us because we live in a modern era and whatnot, but people, I do believe, in the past were a lot more civil, a lot more, because of this idea of there's a God and there's a hierarchy and, you know, there's a social structure, not because of economics, but because of the way things are. I think people were a lot more inclined to, yes, this is my lot. I know it's a bit drab, but this is my lot. This is my birthright, blah, blah, blah. But so civil disobedience was something quite radical back then in the 19th century. But I think, believe it or not, as much as he's known as a pacifist, and rightly so, it was, as far as I can remember, it was Gandhi that first termed the slogan civil resistance. He said that civil disobedience is no longer enough. So civil resistance is that where you actually make an impact in a certain way. You actually stop things, or you create chaos within the calm for a reason. Now, going off what Mr. Pink has just said, it looks like we've started off with civil disobedience, yeah, we went to civil resistance, and it looks like because it's become so diluted over time and so celebrity driven and everybody can create a protest and it's lost all its power, to me it's almost gone back to civil disobedience. Whereas if that's not working, should we not start thinking more about civil resistance? You know, if 2 million people can't stop a war in Iraq, yeah. Then, you know, should we not start thinking, you know what, disobedience is too mild? Now you do get obviously you get the anti-globalization movements and they go around and they smash things and whatnot, and that is some kind of resistance, but it's not real resistance. It's more like it's vandalism for a reason, yeah, to sort of make a point. But, you know, civil resistance is something that's there's a focus there, and as long as it's the right focus, I think the age of civil disobedience as is past. If we want things changing, shouldn't we really be looking at a new age of civil resistance. Mr. Orange.
Yeah, I think that's the main problem we have with the media and with society as a whole, is that it's very hard to, unify a number of people into following something particular, because they're all controlled by, their certain life and their certain, outlook, if that makes sense. I don't know if it does, but how do you reach that many people when you don't have the resources, the media resources, and everyone's hooked on, their lifestyle?
Yeah. No, I totally agree. Yeah, but I mean, just going back to civil resistance, I was reading an article by somebody that I highly recommend to the viewers. It's to do with global warming. She's called Naomi Klein. Now, what she's saying is, from the research she's done on climate change, scientists are actually saying if we factor in the status quo, then we're all pretty much fucked. But what they can't factor in is how big civil resistance will be to the movement of climate change. And because they can't factor that in, according to Naomi Klein, her theory is if that is effective, then climate change, we do have a chance. So from her point of view, what she's saying is, inadvertently, what the scientists are saying, if everything stays as it is, we're fucked, yeah? But if there is a new age of civil resistance, yeah, on a scale that they can't comprehend, but if it's big enough, then it actually could be changed. So what she's saying is, we have to have civil resistance. Her take's obviously on climate change, but what I'm saying is it not time for other things, like stopping countries going to war and whatnot? Mr. Pink had your hand up for a while.
Yeah, just because you went back to civil resistance, it's very hard to be shocking in an era when, let's be honest, there's a lot of chavs and stuff like that. You get on the bus, there's big signs there saying don't put your feet up. They're there scratching the window, feet up, smoking a spliff at the back of the bus. It used to be effective in Gandhi's age when black people had to sit at the back of the bus, and that rule was obeyed. You might be absolutely thirsty, but you don't drink it out of a white-only fountain. When the rules in society were obeyed, then disobeying those rules was shocking. Now, yes, it's a daily occurrence. No one gives a shit about the rules, and they're not enforced. Ergo, you need to be shocking now. And a little bit of disobedience isn't going to get you anywhere. It isn't going to even get you noticed. I mean, most of our celebrities, we've got a bloody show called Benefit Street, and people on that are now being quoted in the paper because they're a celebrity for not conforming to the social norm, for basically sitting on your ass. Nice one. Yeah. Well done, big society.
Horrible.
Okay. Mr. Orange, you got anything to say about that?
In terms of protest or in terms of resistance, I think if getting attention is your goal, then I think you're not gonna be able to get attention by, unless you do something shocking or extreme. This isn't about being shocking. This is about actually resisting something, resisting like social norms or resisting these things. These aren't things worth protesting against or resisting against. It's the things that actually matter. So I think people will sit up and notice or governments will sit up and notice if you're resisting things that they want to do. I don't really understand, and it just seems more of a kind of a popularity contest or a trying to get seen contest than I'd agree with you, but I don't really understand it in the concept of resisting something. Resisting something means you don't do it, and you actively oppose it, and you see what happens at protests.
I think the difference.
You see what the riot police will do. They're noticing it if they're willing to put that much force in, and I think it just depends what it actually is. What you're actually protesting against determines how you'll get noticed for doing it.
Yeah.
Or deliberately not noticed, like the BBC not reporting on the massive protest outside its own doors.
Yeah.
Well, that's because the media is paid by the people who generally want to shut down protests or want this not to come out. So, yeah, it has to be another way around it. But as I say, it's the people who need to notice, they will notice.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll tell you what, it's just this might actually kill two birds with one stone. Just going back to the difference between, say, disobedience and resistance, and just what Mr. Pink was brought up there about, Benefit Street. I think there might be, if we look at the media and sort of the institution that we live in, and how the media it helps the institute educate the masses about what we are supposed to accept and not accept, and who to look up to and who to look down to. It's got like a medium for this type of thing. Now, Benefit Street, you could argue, is a way of demonising the most uneducated, impoverished in society, and not only outcasting them, but outcasting anything that they tend to get involved in, sort of that itself being outcasted because of who they are and what they represent in regards to the media and the institution. But just going back to active resistance, I don't know if you guys have heard of, there's a movement, a very, very small movement that started on a council estate in London. It's some single mothers that were in a hostel. Now, they're in a hostel because they're in abusive relationships. And what happened was, the hostel said, right, everybody out. I think it was they were closing down, and they said, right, what we're going to do is we're going to move some of you to Birmingham, some of you to Manchester, and blah blah. They're the only beds we have. Now, these are single mothers, very, like, when you actually see them, they would what you would be called scallies and chabs. I mean, they are literally the stereotypical scallies and chabs that we all think of, yeah. Overweight, heavy smokers. Can barely string two words together, a bit like me just said. But they are abused mothers, yeah, and in a caring society, what we're saying is, right, you're going to live in Manchester now, we're taking away from your extended family, and we know you're abused, but that's just the way the system is. Now, what they've actually done is, in regards to civil disobedience as opposed to civil resistance, they've actually occupied an estate near them that had been left from between some of the apartments had been left for 4 years, and some of them up to 8 years. So they've literally been sat there with nobody in them, fully furnished. So what they've done is these people that you would literally think couldn't string two thoughts together, let alone become actively resistant against something. Okay, so civil disobedience would just be placards. We want to stay where we are. We want to stay where we are. But effectively, they say no, and off you go to Manchester, yeah? What they've done is they've occupied a couple of flats, and basically got people there supporting them, they've got the community supporting them, they went on national television, and I just think, you know what, that is absolutely fantastic. You're talking about people you would literally think that politics and resistance has no place in their lives, and all they're thinking about is where the next kind of white lightning comes from, yeah? But when it affects their lives and their children's lives, it's like they become elevated on a higher plane of activism. And that, to me, is a fantastic example of the so-called Benefit Street people getting together, creating solidarity, being resistant against the system, and not just accepting it. And I'm thinking, it shames me in a way, because I'm thinking, if they can do that, why can't people with educated people, politically active people, where's the bollocks with these groups? Do you know what I mean? Where is the solidarity and where is the resistance? It's one thing going to protest and waving your placard about in a predefined section of a city, and you're saying, right, it's going to be from 2 till 6, and we're going to walk from there to there, and we're going to shout 15, 16, 17 different slogans, and at the end of it, we're all going to disperse and get on with our middle class lives. Yeah? That's civil disobedience. That, for me personally, that is over. That is over. They have worked it out. And they know the blueprint, and they can stop it. They just absorb it. They just absorb it and make a mockery out of it. It's time for civil resistance. Mr. Pink.
I was just going to congratulate the single mothers there. I mean, well done. You found a resource that was actually being squandered by a local government. Well done on highlighting that. And I hope that they either get to utilise these properties that they've found. I'm absolutely sure the council will come up with some bollocks like, oh, it's riddled with asbestos and that's why we closed them. Or why'd you leave them fully furnished? But, whatever.
Well, apparently, what it was, they're being demolished for fancy flats to be built on them for rich people. That's basically the premise of it. Yeah. So, guys, the power of protest is what it was all about. We've had our discussion. So let's have a bit of a conclusion here. Mr. Orange, can you start us off on this one? So, in your opinion, the power of protest, is it still relevant? Is it still alive? Is it still worth doing?
I think it's, if in worst case scenario, it gets a message across and it lets people know that, those views that are there, that discontent is there. Obviously, a lot of the time, especially in this country and Western countries, and especially when it's something which doesn't directly affect the protesters, there are a lot of flaws, and it doesn't always come across as as real or as grassroots or organic as when it's a protest with a load of people protesting because their homes are getting bombed, for instance, or protesting because it's affecting them directly. But I think it's never a bad thing to have protest. But I think in this day and age, I think it maybe just needs refined. And I think especially in this country, I've noticed that it seems to be protests are the same, and it's the same format, and it's the same results, and the same results are just getting a message out there, and it can be more, and it has been more in the past. And now I sound like I'm giving a speech, but that's just my personal view. There's more subtle ways of doing it. There's more appealing ways of doing it to garner support from other people, and people who wouldn't necessarily be aware of it. And I think that's pretty much all I can sum it up with.
Yeah. Well, I know you're pushed for time, Mr. White. Do you want to go next, mate?
Literally. If you want something to get done, you won't be able to do it with your flat ass on the couch. So if you want something to change, the only thing is to be active, to start a protest. So I do believe the protest has a power. It gives them the people to a chance to think about the subject, about the issue raised by the either a march or maybe some photo on the Facebook, some protesting. Mm-hmm. So it does have it, and I think something we should have.
Okay.
Mr. Brown and Mr. Pink.
Yeah, Mr. Pink, do you want to take?
Yeah, I think there's obviously there is a valid point for protest, and I think, as Mr. Orange rightly said, it needs to be revamped and maybe thought out, maybe use different tools to do it, because doing the same thing and expecting a different result, it's a sure sign of insanity. But I think using multimedia, maybe empowering those that do sit on their ass to actually get involved and do it from the comfort of their own home and not being ostracised by the police and basically picked out and the names put to things. Just going back to your young mothers there, they didn't have anything to lose, and I think unfortunately protesting has become the field of the middle class who do kind of have things to lose, so that's why they go for the protest. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately the people who don't have anything to lose are too busy just trying to make ends meet to actually go on a protest. And it's a sad state of affairs, but I think a good think and a good campaign can still be a valid form of protest and affect change radically. And I would really like to see some more at the moment. I think the only current one we've got is the one in China, and that is staggering at the moment, the peaceful protests there.
So you would actually like to see more protests?
Why not? The status quo isn't working for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, I can see your point there. I mean, from my point of view, the power of protest, I think I touched on it before. For me, the age of civil disobedience is once again, flatlined. And I think the age of resistance is what we need to really focus our energies in. But I also think it's a timing issue. Now, you're never going to get a mathematical equation that says, oh, hang on, if we wait for this day on this time, right, then we all get together and resist, then you will get change. It is hit and miss. So it's a slight paradox in the sense that I'm kind of saying, choose your protests wisely for the timing issue. And I'm also saying, well, you'll never know the timing issue. Okay, so
2020 hindsight, yeah.
Yes, of course, yeah. But I think what protesters today need to understand is that it's not a numbers game. I have been in the past. I've turned up, especially when I was at university. People didn't even ask my name and just wanted me to be at sort of rallies and stuff like that. I think you need to have a more educated body of people rather than an uneducated, not uneducated in the academic sense, but uneducated in the actual what the movement's about, what the protest is about, and just have lots of numbers for the TV. Because at the end of the day, that crowd will disperse. And once they've dispersed, that's the end of it for most people. There's an idea with protest that if I go and it's a bit like charity, if I do a bit of charity today, that means I don't have to do anything for the rest of the week. And I think protest has a similar value. Mr. Pink?
Just going back to your Leonardo DiCaprio, he won't be walking to work, will he now? So he's done his protest, he's got his 2 minutes of fame, and he's got his brownie points straight into the chauffeur-driven car to go to the local shop.
Yeah, and also going back to a numbers game, I believe something like, maybe like 10 million people viewed him speaking, and that's considered a brilliant thing, but what people need to understand is 10 million people, 9.5 million of people were watching because it's Leonardo DiCaprio, yeah? It's only 500,000 that actually care what he's talking about, you know what I mean? So it's not a numbers game, and if people are involved in protests, it's such a noble, I can never say don't do it. It's one of the more noble aspects of humanity. Okay, Mr. Orange, you want to jump in?
I'm possibly going to go against that a little bit. I would say also
go for it.
There is, I think there's also the element of the people who go on protests to kind of build their ego as someone who, cares, and it's maybe a little bit more subtle than, going out and, saying you're good at this or you look like this or what's it called. But I think there's a certain amount of, look at me, I'm such a wonderful person. I go out to these protests. I'm going and I'm fighting for these people who've got nothing, and there is a bit of the do-gooder brigade who, and obviously middle class probably the biggest culprits for it.
Yeah, and just going back to middle classes, I'm not, I am a believer in class. I know some people are, but it's not so much that the middle class. I think Mr. Pink touched on this. It seems to be the most relevant protests are the ones where if this protest goes wrong, we are fucked. Do you know what I mean? It's not one of those, if this protest goes wrong, well, we still go to work tomorrow and everything's fine. It seems to be that immediacy. So I believe if anybody feels that there's an actual cause where it's a case of, do I go to work tomorrow or do I fuck off work and go on this protest? Because if this protest is not successful, we will be fucked in the long term. And I think if people sort of went to protests where they felt that strongly about it, I think those protests would have a bigger energy, just a bigger aura and a bigger energy of people that are there simply because they feel that it's now or never. And I think a lot of protests, especially ones I've been on and what I've seen and that, they're just like charity, I do believe in it, I actually do believe in it, but I'm going because I'm showing my face, and it's some, you know, I want to show my support in one way or another. Mr. Pink, Mr. Orange.
Yeah, and go along with that, I think that's why the biggest kind of resistance or of a kind of protest kind is in the workplace. It is, I mean, isn't a picket line basically a protest?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
And it's because, and the reason that any of those are effective is because it's actually affecting the people who are
and as Mr. Pink said before about these mothers, as noble as it is, if they didn't protest that day, they were on a train to Manchester the next day. So it was like, it's now or never.
Yeah, it's grassroots and it's community based, which is what seems to be lacking in the majority of protests in this country.
And also, I think what would be helpful with protests as well, if people don't see them in their own individualistic manner. So it's not just about a particular job or a particular, hostels and whatnot. If people can thread together sort of an undercurrent of injustice throughout society and start to see themselves as, you know what, yes, this isn't exactly like that protest over there, but with just a little bit of thought, a little bit of education and understanding, you can quite clearly make a bridge from what you're protesting about to what someone else is protesting about. And that in itself makes that you don't see it as an individual cause for you and your work colleagues or for you and your single mothers or whatever. We're all interconnected in this society. And I mean, from my own perspective, and you guys know, I always fall back on what's the economic system that we live in, and that's capitalism. So I can always seem to relate back to the overbearing system of capitalism is one of the major ills in our society. Now, if people start, I'm not saying that you have to think like that, that's the way I've worked it out, but if there has to be some connection between mothers getting kicked out of their hostels, and Benefit Street or a certain section of working class jobs going under, everything's connected. So if people can start educating themselves somewhat into what these connections are, it might create a bigger movement overall. So that's my thoughts on it. Like I say, most noble art, yes, it can be an art actually, but one of the most noble things that humanity can do. I would certainly not, if you're going to a protest this weekend, I hope we haven't talked you out of it. Please go. Please show your support. But for those that are organising it, really, this is a message, you have to think outside of what has been before. If 2 million people cannot stop a poxy government going to a war and killing nearly 2 million people, we're doing something is going wrong. Something's going wrong. So I just want to reiterate, it's not a numbers game, people. It's an intellectual aim. It's a focus. It's a decisive movement. And a protest, don't forget, a protest is just a tactic of a movement. If you're interested in protests, then you have to be interested in what the movement is. There's no point going on a protest if you're not attached to that movement. I would say that as well. Okay, people. No comments this week again. I'm sure people are listening. I hope they are anyway. But guys, please, we're on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. Subscribe. Anything we've said wrong, anything you disagree with, I promise you, as long as it's intelligent, we will bring it up and we will discuss. Don't be shy. We actually want debate. We want to connect with people. We are a podcast, but we'd rather be a debating movement of people of similar intellect. So come on, guys, leave some comments, like the page, share the page, retweet, whatever it is that has to happen for us to get the message out. And we'll see you all next week. Thanks, guys.